Good afternoon. Do I have people out there that can hear me? This is Tara Appleby. I'm with Indiana Quadel, and we are here today for the Special Claims Regular Vacancy training session and a way to learn how to maximize your cash flow. One of the things I'd like to share with everyone today is that it is my assumption that everyone has access to the Special Claims Processing Guide and the HUD's Occupancy Handbook, and as such, you're not here today to have me read that to you. So what we'll be focusing on today are scenarios that in the PBCA role, and I have routinely seen present challenges in the special claims, as well as those items that we routinely see a lot of requests for additional information, or in worst case scenario, adjustments and or denials of claims. So today is going to be about trying to minimize those things and eliminating them if at all possible. We have with us today in the session Quadel's training initiator and administrator, and Nick Murphy, and he is going to be monitoring our on-air session. So as you have questions, feel free to type those in, and those that Nick can answer, he will. Those that need me to field, we will get those covered to the best of our abilities. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. To share with you a little bit more about me, as I said, my name is Tara Appleby, and I am beginning my 30th year of housing. And I started on site, and I transitioned to working with owners and agents, and for the past 16 years I have been exclusively with the PBCA here in Indiana, with Indiana Quadel. I routinely participate in HUD focus groups and work groups that are related to tracks and vouchers and special claims processing. And as a result of that, I feel that my experiences have really provided a diverse and unique perspective for the industry. So what we're going to be seeing today stems from those experiences, those 30 years of experience. I've dealt with 11 different states and HUD offices in those states, and so these items, as we talk about recommendations and some best practices, do stem from that experience. So for today's topics, we're going to cover resources that are available to everyone, eligibility and timelines. We'll talk a little bit about determining and supporting the ready for occupancy date, or you will constantly see us refer to that as an RFO date to shorten it. Submission requirements and helpful hints. Waiting list requirements, which is a big item. The Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan, which we will shorten to AFHMP. And the appeals process. So that is everything that we will be covering today. So just some quick reference for you. The resources for special claims where we're pulling this information, first and foremost, would be HUD's Special Claims Processing Guide, the HSG 0601, and we have provided the link for you from HUD Clips to be able to download a copy of that if you or your staff need that. The Special Claims Processing Guide FAQ, which was a separate Word document that came out after the guide was released and does offer quite a bit of clarification, in some cases does clean up the areas that may be a little bit gray still in the processing guide. Something that you may not think of as being a resource, but your original HAP contract and the related Code of Federal Regulations is also something that routinely becomes a resource, and one situation in particular that we'll cover in just a little bit. The HUD handbook, the 4350.3, revision 1, change 4, and in particular for the special claims, you will see a lot of reference for chapters 2, 4, and 6. Again, we've provided the link in HUD Clips where you are able to download a copy of that handbook in its entirety or any individual piece and part of it that you might like to have. The property's Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan, the tenant selection plan, as well as the specific HUD forms that are a part of the special claims process for regular vacancy, which is what we'll be covering today. Now, when we talk about the vacancy claims for regular vacancy, there are specific project and contract types that are eligible. Those are your Section 8, Section 202 with 8, Section 202 PAC, Section 202 PRAC, and the 811 PRACs. Now, as we go through this list, you'll notice that there's a project contract type that is missing, and that is the 515.8 projects. Based upon the basic guidelines in the Special Claims Processing Guide and Figure 1.1 in particular as a part of that, the 515.8 projects are not listed. We have learned over the last couple of years through some correspondence with HUD headquarters that there are some special conditions with which the 515.8 projects may be eligible for the vacancy claims. That guidance came to us in October of 2015 through fielding some questions. And in these specific conditions, they may be eligible for vacancy and debt service claims only. And for those of you that this would apply to, the contract would be eligible if we can answer yes to all of the following questions. That the original loan is paid in full, that Section 1.6 of the property's original HAP contract does indicate eligibility. So a perfect example of where that HAP contract becomes a reference source for you for your claims processing. And that the property meets all of the requirements in the Code of Federal Regulations that's found in HUD Clips. Now, where you would pull this from is Figure 1.1 in the Special Claims Processing Guide gives the example of all of the project and contract types, and it references each of the Code of Federal Regulations. In this instance, it's the 884. And for those of you that would need to find this Code of Regulation to review for your specific contract, if you'd like to take a few notes, I'll actually, aside from this link where you can drill down in HUD Clips, and this is an area where we're not typically in HUD Clips for this side. So usually we're here, handbooks, letters, guidebooks, notices, forms, so on and so forth. We're flipping over to the other side, and you have your codes, your Code of Federal Regulations right here. And so once you get there in HUD Clips, where you will go specifically is you'll be scrolling down to Title 24, selecting Subtitle B as in boy. Then you'll need to select Chapter 8, Part 884, and then Subpart A, 884.106. But in reference to the previous screen, we gave the citation, the 24.884.106. So you can get there and drill down. It just takes quite a bit to get to the appropriate location. It took us quite a bit of time to find the appropriate spot to be able to work and communicate with HUD headquarters for clarification that we did in fact have some projects that based upon these guidelines were eligible. So it's good information to remember for those of you that have those 515.8s. Now when we talk about eligibility, We like to say that there are initial eligibility tests when you're sitting down or your staff are sitting down to start processing a special claim. And if you go through these initial eligibility tests, if you get a one strike, it's a one strike, you're out. Any of these conditions that are present, that are not fulfilled, there is no eligible claim. So that's something to remember. And you're only going to submit those claims to your local head office or your PBCA that would pass these initial eligibility tests. The first and foremost is that the unit in question is ready for occupancy and that you do have those documents to support that. And we'll talk more about what that is later on this afternoon. That the receipt of the documentation to the party you submit, either HUD or your PBCA, will be within HUD's 180-day submission deadline. And it's important to remember that from special claims, when HUD specifies a day timeline for a deadline, they are referring to calendar days. They are not referring to business days, which is a big distinction at different times of the year with holidays and weekends. So remember, we're always referring to calendar days. That the household for which you want to submit the claim was a Section 8 recipient at the time of move out. Now, the exceptions to that would be if the resident was terminated for a failure to recertify. Those households are still eligible to submit vacancy claims. The household's move out must be viewable in tracks. The processing guidebook says that if for some reason tracks rejected the move out or something failed with your software and you're not able to get the move out transmitted, that you must submit an HQ assisted move out request so that that move out can be processed for you. And if you are concerned about a delay in getting that submitted and still meeting your 180-day submission deadline, most HUD and PBCA entities reviewing claims will simply accept documentation that you have in fact submitted that move out request to the multifamily help desk, and will take that as the appropriate requirement for the tracks viewable. Any overpayment that was identified during your voucher review for that household in question has been reimbursed to HUD via the voucher, and that has to happen before you can request a special claim. Now we have some cases where there's also partially assisted projects that have various types of subsidy programs, and you may have 236 renters and different programs within the project. In those cases, it's very important that if you intend to submit a special claim, that the assistance cannot be transferred to another household for the claim period. So in the requirement, which is in the Section 8 processing guide, it refers to the partially assisted projects that there is no eligible claim if the household assistance on those mixed-use properties was terminated and if the vacated household had their assistance transferred to another unit the day after termination or move out. So just be mindful if you are a property with partially assisted projects that you go back to the handbook and the processing guide and refer to this and make sure that you are in compliance so that you don't miss out on the opportunity to submit a special claim. Now, some further eligibility requirements, as we mentioned before in the initial checklist, is that the claim unit is ready for occupancy and that it meets HUD standard of decent, safe, and sanitary. A big Eligibility requirement for special claims that has a far-reaching impact is that the owner agent has taken and continues to take all feasible actions to fill the vacancy. The citation in the processing guide goes on here to say that that includes working the waiting list, pre-screening applicants, so that the moment that the property learns that there is going to be a vacancy, that they are working that waiting list, pre-screening those applicants. So their actions ideally will, if not eliminate the need for a vacancy claim, it will reduce it to the fullest extent possible, and that is HUD's intent, and that is the way the guidelines are specified. A part of that is making sure that the unit's being advertised in accordance with the Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity requirements in the 4350.3, and it does imply a sense of urgency on the property's part for there to be some aggressive, timely pre-screening and working of that waiting list. Also, that applicants are only rejected for good cause and that those reasons are consistent with your current tenant selection plan. And the rejections becomes a part of a waiting list that we'll be talking later about, making sure that all of those proper notations are fully documented for that part of the process. So if we talk about the claim period, as long as we've been doing this for so many years, and it seems that there is sometimes questions about what the claim period involves and when the claim period actually begins. So the claim period begins the date that the unit is ready for occupancy, that RFO date. And it ends the day preceding that the unit is reoccupied, or 60 calendar days from your ready for occupancy date, whichever of the two scenarios becomes earlier. And at no time can the claim period exceed 60 calendar days. So when you think about the submissions, we'd like to give you an overview of the timeline. What should you expect on your end once you've put this package together and sent it on its way? According to the guidelines, your HUD office or PBCA, whichever one you're submitting to, is given 30 calendar days with which to respond to your initial submission. That initial submission may be an incomplete package, it may be a complete package, but either way, you must have some level of response from the HUD PBCA within 30 calendar days. Now, more specifically, if it's an incomplete package, the guidelines allow two different scenarios, and depending upon whom you're dealing with, which HUD office or which PBCA office you're dealing with, you will see one of these two scenarios. They may return your incomplete package to you in its entirety, in which case resubmissions have to be a complete resubmission, or they may simply make an additional information request, and you may see that condensed in email communications or written communications as an AIR, an additional information request. Regardless of which one of those protocols the HUD and PBCA decide to employ, once the owner agent has been notified of the additional information needed or the shortcoming of their submission, they must respond and submit all necessary data back to the HUD and the CA within 30 calendar days from the date of notification. And again, calendar days versus business days can really be a big difference. We as a PBCA strongly recommend to all of our owners and agents in all of their submissions for special claims, be it submission, a resubmission, or an appeal, we strongly encourage them to utilize tracking methods and to retain those records when they are submitting their claims. So, you know, some of you will be mailing, some of you will be emailing, depending upon the protocol preferred with the HUD or PBCA you're working with. And as you can well imagine, there is a large volume of submissions, and so once in a blue moon something can go awry, something can go amiss, and so having those tracking methods retained will help you. You'll be able to say, I know that we mailed this submission on this date, here is my carrier message. You know, if you're doing FedEx or you're doing UPS or you're doing regular postal service, but you can still use tracking methods. Or if you're emailing, that you want to keep and retain your delivery and your read receipts. They will clarify the process for you if there's ever a question about the submission timeline. Now, the other element on the incomplete packages is that it's good to remember is that if for some reason that requested data does not arrive at the HUD or PBCA office within 30 calendar days from the date of notification, that submission then is denied and there is no longer an option for appeal. So that is very important to remember and keep track for your staff of those calendar days and making sure that you're taking into account any weekends, holidays, and so forth. And again, another good reason for maintaining those tracking methods so that if there is a question you can produce and say, we know we submitted within the appropriate timeline and here is our evidence. Nothing worse than to have a claim lost and denied with no option for appeal simply because the information arrived on day 31 when the HUD requirement is that it must arrive within day 30. So for complete packages, same requirement from HUD PBCA, we must respond within 30 calendar days of the receipt of a complete submission. When you, as the owner agent and property, get your responses back, it will include the approved amounts, the claim types, and the special claim ID number. Reduced claims must include the reason or reasons for a reduction, and that they must also indicate to you that you do have the right to appeal. Once you have those determinations, your reimbursement protocol, the request for reimbursement for the approved or adjusted claims, the guidebook says should occur on the first available voucher. But it also states that they must be submitted within 90 calendar days of the approval date. A failure to request that within 90 calendar days, again, is a scenario that results in denial of the claim, and there is no option for appeal. So again, two scenarios that you really need to be mindful of with your dates on calendar days to make sure that you are not losing money for which you would have been entitled to otherwise. So that's your overview, and now we're going to get into a little more of the nitty-gritty, more of the meat and potatoes of the submissions and the scenarios that we see creating challenges. The ready for occupancy date, the RFO date, seems like it should be really cut and dry, but for whatever reason it frequently is not. As we stated before, the claim period begins the day that the unit is available for occupancy. Now, what does that mean? The guidebook says that that equals the day after the last work was performed to prepare the unit. So as you're going through, many of you, as a CA, we see as many different versions of documentation to support a ready for occupancy date as there probably are owners and agents out there. I would venture to guess that I doubt that there is any HUD office or PVCA that has one hard, fast requirement of what that documentation needs to look like, as long as it fits the bill, as long as it supports the steps. We oftentimes, in knowing that we work in the industry, will say, well, wait a minute, if the guidebook says that the ready for occupancy date has to be the day after last work was performed to prepare the unit, and we realize that in the real world time that it's entirely possible to have, you know, prep work completed in the morning, you conduct your final walkthrough maybe later in the morning or in the afternoon, and someone moves in later that day, and that happens in real world all the time. But from HUD's perspective, they state that the ready for occupancy date must be the first day after all work is completed. So that is something that you need to be mindful of. And there have been many instances where this requirement, it changes, where there in the property's mind would be an eligible claim for one vacancy day, when in fact, according to the guidelines, it becomes a 0 vacancy day claim because of when the work was performed and completed. This statement is supported in the guidebook under the processing guide for special claims in Chapter 3 under Section 3.4. B as in boy, and it's the example there where they give a very clear example of calculating the ready for occupancy date. So documenting the ready for occupancy date, as I said, we've got lots of different versions of supporting documentation. Those of you that have been in the industry for a long time, since before the Special Claims Processing Guide came out and even longer, know that the requirements for processing special claims used to be incorporated as a part of the occupancy handbook, the 4350.3, Chapter 9 in fact, and in that chapter it specified very clearly in the language that start and finish dates for each phase of unit prep to document the ready for occupancy date was required. Well, when they produced the Special Claims Processing Guide, they modified that language, and if you read it through and through, you will no longer see a citation that states you must include start and finish dates for each phase of unit prep. What you will find, however, is in Appendix 3C, which is a part of the Special Claims Processing Guide, they provide a sample vacancy reconditioning log. And in that sample, from the sample itself, it certainly implies HUD's intent that you will still provide start and finish dates for each phase of unit prep. As an example, this list went on to list all the various components of unit prep, and I just condensed it just to show the first one, the maintenance, but you will see that it does include both a start date and a finish date, and as such the implication is there that HUD is still looking for a start and finish for each phase. So what you'll want to do is you will definitely want to keep that in mind. I know that within the state of Indiana we do have many different versions, but overall our owners and agents do a wonderful job of providing this information and supporting it. Where this vacancy reconditioning log, I will throw a little caveat in there and kind of a nod to the webinar that we'll be doing next month in February for damage and unpaid rent. This vacancy reconditioning log also becomes a place where it can be a supporting resource for supporting extenuating circumstances for charges that are above reasonable and customary in the industry for preparing the unit. So that's just something to think about in a way that this form can be utilized, and it is not always used. But I digress to next month's session. So if we come back into our vacancy claims and we start talking about some of the more heavy submission requirements and some of the hints that may help make this process smoother, more efficient for everyone. Our goal today is, again, to help make sure you all have the resources and the tools you need to be able to put your packages together so that ideally you get every penny of the vacancy claim that you feel you're entitled to. First and foremost, from the Special Claims Processing Guide, Chapter 3, Section 3.3, that section has to do with the owner-agent submission requirements. So of course that would be where you would be looking. We also refer our owners and agents to, again, Chapter 3 of the Special Claims Processing Guide, but this time Section 3.5, which is the HUD PBCA review portion. And it's interesting the difference in the languages between those two citations, one being the owner-agent submission requirement, the second being the HUD PBCA review. And the language for which the HUD PBCA review requirements is much more detailed and in-depth. And I think that sometimes it appears that the challenges that we may have with respect to the vacancy claims and the difference in needing to request additional information is that the site staff potentially putting these claim packets together are not considering the fuller extent of the review requirements that must be enforced. So that's good information to sort of make sure that you're also looking at what is the review by HUD and PBCA requirement so that you understand you're fulfilling that requirement as well. The occupancy handbook still, even though the Special Claims Processing Guide is in existence, there, as those of you who have put the packages together before know that there are many references to the occupancy handbook in the Special Claims Processing Guide, and each one of those references becomes important and a part of the requirement for the submission, and those that we see most commonly we will be touching on here today. So as you sit down to put your package together, the broad overview things that need to be happening, use whatever checklist is requested by your local HUD field office or PBCA, whomever you are submitting to. The guidebook does state that there is a checklist that is required, and so you'll want to familiarize yourself with whomever your serving body is so that you're using the format that they want for you. Make sure that you're including full contact information for that HUD PBCA follow-up if there are any questions, and make sure that it is clear and that it is easily read. I know from previous experience and that we oftentimes see a lot of information handwritten that's been scanned or emailed in, and sometimes it's very difficult to read, and it has presented delays and challenges in trying to communicate with those property or owner agent contacts in order to get the information needed for claim approval. Something really simple, make sure that you sign and date all of the required HUD forms. I know that sometimes, you know, especially from when my days on site and putting these packages together, you get really busy and you're putting all of this documentation together, and sometimes it's very simple to miss a form. And you could have an entire submission that's perfect, and the only thing that's preventing you from the HUD or PBCA from approving is the fact that the forms are not signed. So make sure that you sign and date each and every one. Something else that oftentimes isn't thought about, when you are preparing the HUD forms, only list the eligible units on the HUD forms. If you went through your initial eligibility checklist, you've gone through and you've identified that you have a unit in question that you thought you were going to have a vacancy claim for, or any claim for that matter, and find out that nope, it doesn't meet all of the eligibility requirements, then there is absolutely no need to list it on the form or to submit any of the data to HUD or your PBCA. If it's not eligible, they don't want it. There's nothing they can do with it, and so it's a waste of your time as well as theirs and the resources to put that information in the packet. Again, as I've said before, use and retain your tracking methods for submission. These are so important, and they come in handy in all of my years of doing business with, you know, various HUD offices across the country. I've specifically dealt with 11 different states routinely over the years, and I'm here to tell you that being able to have some form of documentation that confirms that you definitely mailed something or definitely emailed something on a specific date that is irrefutable will help you. And there are times that, you know, something goes wrong and the information does not appear to get to the HUD or PBCA where it should be. But if you have that evidence that it was sent, then often, most always, they will re-look at that and then consider that claim to be eligible. Now, keep in mind that some HUD PBCAs do have submission preferences. As example, I've heard of some PBCAs that will only accept special claims, or HUD offices that will only accept special claims if they're mailed. There are others that have gone more to the current technology and actually prefer the email with scanned attachments, as long as those submissions are small enough to be able to facilitate that type of receipt. So just familiarize yourself with your governing body, whether that you'd be submitting to, whether it would be HUD or the PBCA, and just understand what their preferences are and their associated protocol. Make sure you're clear on that, and then follow that request. As example, one of the things here in Indiana, we follow an electronic library system, and so even if something comes into us in paper, it is all presented through our administrative staff as a part of the electronic library. And so for us, submissions that come in with staples or post-it notes or big original two-sided color brochures or newspaper ads from whole newspaper print, or even highlighters in something other than the customary traditional yellow, is problematic for us, and it takes more time to get that information prepared and ready for review. So those are just little things that, you know, you just want examples of knowing the company that you're working with, the body that you're working with, and sort of falling with those preferences. So further in your submission requirements is something that is oftentimes forgotten, is the guidebook. The processing guide does say that the submission must include a signed move-in 50059 copy. Something to remember with this is an example, if the vacancy claim that you're submitting, the person, say, they originally lived in one unit and had, during the course of their residency, had transferred at some point. And so it's important, and the claim that you're processing on is the post-unit transfer. So it's important to make sure that it's the tenant's original move-in 59 that's being provided in that case. Documentation confirming that the security deposit collection, as it's required in the occupancy handbook, there is figure 6.7, which details what the security deposit collection requirements are based upon the program and contract type. And it's important to note that for the submission, we have to have confirmation of the amount collected, not just charged. Sometimes the submissions do come in and it shows that there was an amount due and charged, but they don't provide the documentation that to show that the amount was actually collected in full. The reason that that becomes important is that any eligible claim that did not collect the full required amount prior to vacancy has to be reduced by the shortage amount of that security deposit. So that's why there has to be verification of the full collection. And again, this is also something a little different for those of you that have been around for a really long time. It's actually more to the owner agent's benefit. In the old school days, any claim where the full proper security deposit amount was not collected prior to vacancy, there was simply just no eligible claim. You were done. There was no claim available to the property for that household. So this was a change a positive change in the owner agent's favor. So now if there is a shortage, maybe you allowed someone to move in on a payment plan or something and they moved out still owing the last payment, then you are still eligible for the claim as long as all other requirements are in place. It would just simply be reduced by that amount that was not collected. Another requirement is the security deposit disposition notice to the former tenant. And one of the things that we see that creates a big challenge and a lot of additional information requests is that there seems to be a misconception that if the household transferred and that was the cause of the vacancy, that's what caused the vacancy claim, that action, that there isn't a security deposit disposition notice needed. And there is no exclusion in the processing guide for unit transfers. So where the disposition notice per se may not be what you customarily send to a resident, there does still need to be some final settlement of account for the unit between the resident and the property in whatever way that may look. And again, what may be acceptable will vary from state to state and from head office to PBCA office. As an example, some of the things that we see are we will oftentimes get a copy of the move-out inspection report that shows that there were no damages, so we know there are no damage charges, and it's signed by both the resident and the property, along with a succinct summary statement of their tenant ledger that shows that there was no tenant balance due. And that's an example of, like in Indiana, what we've done. But again, it can take many different forms, and it's just a matter of what's acceptable to your local HUD field office and or PBCA. If the vacancy was the result of a unit transfer, there are additional requirements from the processing guide, and those include providing the documentation for the reason of the unit transfer. The guidebook says that unit transfers will only be allowed for good cause. So we need to make sure that that is being followed. And it also states that in the event of a unit transfer that we have to have evidence that either the security deposit was transferred or that a new one was collected. So in the example I gave of a security deposit disposition notice kind of resolution for unit transfers was kind of the two-piece of the move-out inspection report as well as a tenant ledger. The tenant ledger would also help support this last requirement that the security deposit was either transferred or that a new one was collected. So that helps fit the bill on two different fronts. Further submission requirements and recommendations, especially when we're talking about the ready for occupancy dates. As I said earlier, I alluded to this one creates some challenges sometimes for the submission. So we need to have documentation verifying the unit's ready for occupancy date. And as I said before, that takes on all different kinds of forms, just about as many as there are owners and agents out there. One of the items that you need to be prepared to support are those longer unit prep times or the instances where those delays in the unit prep appears to have negatively impacted the claim. The reason for that is this falls back to that section at the very beginning of Chapter 3 that I said has very broad-reaching scope and related to the owner agent taking all feasible actions to fill the vacancy. This ties directly into that. So this is another example where the actions of the staff on the property and how they're handling the property on a business side can impact the claim. And for most of the states, we are all now seeing that the management and occupancy reviews are back up and running through the HUD's national rebid of the PBCA work several years ago. There were, as you know, there were several protests, and all but 11 states had protests, and so those awards and contract awards were suspended and the existing PBCAs stayed in their role. But during that time, for all but the 11 states, the management and occupancy reviews were suspended by HUD headquarters and have only just recently this year come back online. The practice was very common that to support ready for occupancy dates and the length of time is that the people reviewing special claims with HUD or the PBCA would review the MOR report. And those of you familiar with that report know that there is a question that is asked and asked to be supported, which is what the property's average unit prep time is for those vacant units. And so it was very customary for those of us reviewing special claims to review that report, look at what is being stated from the property and the owner agent on their unit prep times for that specific property, and then looking at what we're seeing in special claims to see if we had consistency. And if we didn't have consistency and we had variations, then those would be instances where we would ask for there to be some additional support, to explain the nature of the delay. As an example, if you saw that a unit took 23 days to prep or 45 days to prep, obviously there need to be some very special circumstances that resulted in that. And for vacancy claims, those kinds of lengthy turn times can absolutely negatively impact a special claim period. You can have people that have found other units and gone elsewhere to another property because they got tired of waiting for the unit to be available. So those are the types of things that for HUD and the PBCA that it is their obligation to be reviewing and to be considering, and how the actions of the property may have negatively impacted that claim. A very common submission requirement across the board is to request the resident's notice to vacate. Now, and if there was none provided, to provide documentation of how and when the property learned of the vacancy. And this is something that at times gets questioned, and because people will rightly say, I couldn't find any direct statement in the Special Claims Processing Guide that said I needed to give my resident's notice to vacate. And that's a correct statement. It's not directly stated as a specific need, but it is implied indirectly in that, again, that statement that the owner agent has taken every feasible action to fill the vacancy. The purpose behind the resident's notice to vacate supports that the owner's actions were timely to fill the vacancy. From the point that the property learns that there is a vacancy or there's going to be a vacancy, that is the time that there should be active action on working the waiting list, pre-screening the applicants, trying to, working and getting those applicants contacted, trying to get that vacancy filled. So that's where this common submission requirement comes from and why. Now, a couple of special circumstances where you, of course, aren't going to have a traditional notice to vacate, and how we typically handle those. One, obviously, is if the resident has passed, so you're obviously not going to have the notice to vacate there. But oftentimes what comes in is the property will simply say the resident passed away, or they won't even say anything. They'll just provide a photocopy of the resident's obituary. But that still doesn't tell us how and when they learned about it, or if there's an eviction or a skip. They'll simply say, eviction or skip. Again, it doesn't tell us how and when they knew that the unit was going to be vacant or was vacant. So as an example, if it was a skip, you would the most common response is simply to say, keys were dropped in the drop box. Or if no keys were returned whatsoever, when the resident's not responding to the late rent notices, or your maintenance staff or others are finding, mail or papers or something piled up outside the door, then again you have an obligation to check on the unit, and then you would simply say that you did a unit check, found the unit vacant. For an eviction, typically you provide the copy of the notice, the termination of tenancy that was provided to the resident. And so those are the points when you know there's going to be a vacant unit, or you have a vacant unit, so therefore there needs to be action from the property to start trying to fill that unit. Another submission requirement in the guidebook is that the move out or the unit transfer, if that was the cause, is viewable in tracks. Also, that if the unit was re-rented during the claim period, that the move-in or the unit transfer is viewable in tracks. Now, you'll note that there are several of the HUD offices or PBCAs that require the tracks online print screens showing those certifications as a part of the submission. As you know, those of us in the industry know that tracks oftentimes is not always available for us when we need it to be or want it to be, and so providing those print screens in the submission helps facilitate the approval. There have been plenty of times where you're going through and all you need is to verify that that move out is in tracks or that the new move in is in tracks, and you can't, the tracks is down. So again, that's one of the reasons why many of them will say just when you're preparing the packet, just provide those print screens. A couple of scenarios that may be a little bit different for this, like as an example, if the new move-in or the unit transfer is not a subsidized resident, it's not subsidized rent, then the guidebook says to simply provide a copy of the market rent 50059 in the submission to support that. And in cases where the move-out was rejected by tracks, which does happen at times if the move out is too close to the next recert date or the last recert date, it oftentimes will not be accepted. In those instances, again, it does state that we need the property needs to have submitted an HQ assisted move out request. Just simply show evidence that you've made that request to fulfill this piece of the requirement that the move out, to speak to why your move out isn't viewable. For claim amounts, I'm not going to go into the details of the claim amounts, but the Special Claims Processing Guide does detail that in Chapter 3, Section 3.3, like Frank, and it is identified by project and contract type. So there are different calculation allowances and considerations for the maximum claim amounts based upon project and contract type. So just make sure that you review those carefully based upon your specific needs so that you can ensure compliance. Okay, let's talk about waiting lists. This is a big one. And we could probably have done an entire session doing nothing but having an interactive session of questions and answers on waiting lists. And so we're going to try to get the hot points today. Several different citations that refer to the waiting list requirements, and again, the Special Claims Processing Guide, Section 3.3, that has to do with the owner-agent submission requirements. Chapter 3, Section 3.5, as referenced earlier, has to do with the HUD PBCA review requirements, which are important to keep in mind even from the property owner agent side, because the language used in the two are very different. Also in Chapter 3, Section 3.2, those have more to do with the statements we've talked about before, how that the requirement of the owner agent, it specifically says has taken and continues to take all feasible actions to fill the vacancy, and it goes on from there with the various requirements of making sure that you're advertising appropriately, screening and contacting applicants appropriately from the waiting list, and so on and so forth. It's quite extensive. Special claims frequently asked question. There is, for those of you that may forget about that document, it is also a great resource, and it offers quite a bit of clarification on the owner-agent requirements of the waiting list function. And then the occupancy handbook change for Chapter 4, Section 3 in particular. Section 3 is all of waiting list management. Now, I think the biggest challenge that we see with waiting lists across the board is the acknowledgement that the guidebook says, the occupancy handbook says, and I've pulled this from 418, Chapter 4, the very first statement, whenever a change is made in the waiting list, an action is taken, or an activity specific to an applicant occurs, a notation must be made on the waiting list. That's a really heavy statement. It's really loaded. And what that means is that your waiting list has to tell the story of every single applicant from the entire process from start to finish. So from the moment they're placed on your waiting list until the moment they come off your waiting list. It has to tell the story of everything that happened in that arc in between, everything. And if you go further down into 418B, that it has to provide the audible record of those changes and what the goal of that is and what independent reviewers must be able to do by looking at your waiting list. The last one, that we have to be able to trace various actions taken with respect to the family's application for tenancy. If you stop and think about that for a moment, and you think about waiting list formats, regardless of whether you're dealing with an electronic waiting list or a handwritten waiting list. Most waiting list formats, they don't accommodate those kinds of documentations and those kinds of notations, do they? They just simply don't. There's not enough space to document it. And if yours is a format that doesn't, that's okay. We're not, HUD and the PBCAs are not saying you have to change that. What you simply need to do is you need to incorporate some extra with your waiting list. And I would probably state that the overwhelming majority of you are already doing this anyway. And we refer to applicant contact logs that are commonly used to support the activity for each applicant. And oftentimes these are attached with the applications, and these are the notes that a lot of times your site staff are actually doing, where they've got the notes of the date and the time and that they called, John Smith and, told them he needed some additional third-party verification information, and that Mr. Smith came and brought the information in, and so then the next day it was mailed out. It's these kinds of things as you're going through the part of the process, and then after you got the third-party verifications back, and then you called Mr. Smith back to say, hey, we have this unit coming available. It's going to be available in 45 days. Are you going to want this unit? These are the types of things that we're finding most properties already have. They're just not including it. So this is the detailed information that tells the story of the arc of what's happening with your applicants. That is a requirement for us to review to make sure that you have fulfilled all of the requirements of acting appropriately, filling the unit at the appropriate time. So as we've said, the documentation has to support the entire applicant process and all related actions and contacts. Some hints on your waiting list. The waiting list, in order for us to trace the actions of the applicant history, that 418 reference, we have to have the waiting list in applicant order. If they're not, we can't follow the history and the dates of what's happened. Notations need to include specific unit or units that were offered and that were taken. They need to include your applicant needs, the preferences, and the income levels. And something to consider is that, again, you know, there can be a HUD or PBCA preference on whether or not a full waiting list copy is provided versus simply pages for the claim period. So just make sure you understand what your governing body feels is necessary for your claim, and then just, follow that. For those of you that are fortunate enough to have an extensive waiting list with not many vacancies, there are very specific actions required for closing and reopening the waiting lists. And the requirements are in the occupancy handbook in Chapter 4, Section 3, specifically 416B, that will detail everything that would need to happen if you're in a position to be able to close your waiting list and then at some point reopen it. The Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan really ties into the waiting list and ties into your vacancy claims, because in instances where you are either not, if you're not filling the unit from your waiting list, then the marketing has to be provided in order to support your vacancy claim. So we have your reference for the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan. Again, it's in the Housing Handbook, and it's Chapter 4, Section 2 for that. There was clarification provided regarding the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan review and approval. It came out in a HUD headquarters memo that was dated September 22nd of 2014. It was from Benjamin Metcalf, who was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multifamily Housing Programs. Basically, succinct, it was several pages memo, but it states that the owner agent must review their Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan if 5 years have passed since the last review, or their local jurisdiction's consolidated plan has been updated, or the significant demographic changes have occurred in the industry. So basically, any of those three, you have to review the plan. If you've reviewed it and find that the plan is still sufficient to meet the property's needs, then you may simply document that with a simple statement or on a quick memo, and then may provide that with the claim to support that you have fulfilled the review requirement. Now, there are also some requirements regarding when you must update your plan. So if any of the preceding circumstances, those three we just talked about, exist, and your analysis has determined that the population least likely to apply is not identified in your current plan, or your existing protocol is no longer appropriate, or a second scenario is that you've adopted a HUD-approved residency preference for those in a specific geographic area that furthers the goal of your Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan, and that you have adopted a new HUD-approved admissions preference. So if those two items exist, as well as the three, then you must update the plan. Updates go to your HUD account executive, and if you have deemed that you needed to update the plan, as was with the review, you can simply state that with a succinct statement, provide a copy of the letter submitted to your HUD account executive where you have submitted and requested approval of an updated plan, and that should support the requirement for continued claim approval. Now, appeals. As I said earlier, that any reduced or denied claim, that HUD or the PBCA must let you know that you have a right to appeal that claim. And that provision is in place as long as your initial submission or your resubmission deadline was not missed. Keep that in mind. If you miss the initial submission or resubmission deadline, there is no option for appeal. An appeal must be submitted within 30 calendar days of the HUD PBCA claim determination that was returned to you. The appeal must include a brief explanation why the claim should be paid and any new or additional supporting information that you believe is necessary to garner approval. Something to bear in mind, if you are submitting an appeal, you must delay requesting voucher reimbursement for any part of that claim that may have been approved or adjusted until you've gone through the full appeals process and the final determination of the appeal has been received. And the reason for that is that HUD requires a unique special claim ID number, and each ID number can only be reported to TRACS one time. So as an example, say you submitted a regular vacancy claim for 5 households and 4 of the households were approved in full. One household claim was either denied or adjusted, and you are appealing that decision. Then that you have to wait to request the amount for all of those that were approved until you hear back from this appeal. Now, what to expect in the appeal process? Your HUD or PBCA must respond to your appeal within 30 calendar days of their receipt. The appeal determination will include details of the decision, and if necessary will include a revised approval letter for you to use for your voucher reimbursement request. And in that case, it's just like any other approved claim that you should, the owner agents should request the approval on the next scheduled voucher, but they must request it within 90 calendar days of the appeal determination. A failure to do that, then the appeal is denied and it's gone, it's dead, and you're no longer able to get that. And this is all part of the submission requirements that the HUD allows the owner and agent one original submission, one resubmission, and one appeal only. And that is in the Special Claims Processing Guide. It's in Chapter 1, Section 1.5. So that brings us to a close of our Special Claims Regular Vacancy and our first Special Claims webinar. There's a lot of exciting things happening with Quadel, and we have some great upcoming training sessions coming up. We have a tax credit compliance course coming up just this next month right here in Indy. And we also have some assisted housing manager sessions coming up. The next 2 scheduled are one in Philadelphia, one in Columbus, Ohio, with the dates there and the information for registering at quadel.com. And there is a 3rd AHM class that is tentatively scheduled in New York for May, but the dates are yet to be determined. So keep looking for that for those of you out on the East Coast. If you're interested in bringing training to your location or partnering with us with Quadel on hosting a training, you can visit our website to request a proposal, and that's at quadel.com/proposal. And any further inquiries that you might have on training or specific training needs, maybe you want to look into customizing a training course, then you have Nick Murphy as our training administrator and his contact information that can be listed. Now, if we have any questions, it looks like I think we have one question. I just need to try to get to it. Nick Murphy is online for us. Can you help me navigate where that question may be? I'm not seeing it. here we go. Oh, it says I already answered the question. Never mind. Okay. The question was the 180-day deadline is from the ready date, and that is correct. The 180-day submission deadline is from the documented ready for occupancy date. Yes, that's correct. Do we have any other questions? If the resident that, okay, here we go, we're reading. If the resident that transfers to another unit has increased income, which would work out to a higher security deposit than originally collected, do you have to collect the higher security deposit amount? Oh, that is a good question. Well, you know, I think, Pam, that is a question that may actually go more to compliance than from a vouchering standpoint. So is that Pam Pravdika? Is that correct? If I'm correct, can you just type in there, yes, that's correct? And what we could do is I will make sure that I get that question answered. Oh, Pam Collins, okay. I will make sure that we get an answer to that question for you, and I will email you the response to that, because we should have your email from your registration. So unit transfer, security deposit now higher from the rent. So we'll make sure we get that answered for you. And going through. I think we have all the questions answered. Sorry, this is my first time doing this, so I'm learning learning on how to handle these questions popping up in this little box. But I promise we'll get better by the second one for those of you that are going to join us for our damages and unpaid rent on February 22nd. We're looking forward to that one. That's going to be, I'm expecting that one to be quite interactive. And it is my understanding that the presentation, for those of you that are participating today, that the presentation will be made available to you, and you will get information on that from the email that you used for your registration. Yes, and the question has been asked, could I please send the answer to the unit transfer question to everyone? I can certainly do that. Now, there's a second question that's asking about a corrected move-in, if you're required to adjust the security deposit if the resident failed to report the income. And in that, there is language in the occupancy handbook that in that scenario would not require the property to collect a new deposit. If the resident had failed to report income appropriately and the result of the corrected move-in would appear to change the security deposit, that a new security deposit collection would not be required. You would stick with the original. So you would be providing that original move-in on your submission for your special claim. And I think we'll give a moment and see if anyone else has anything more questions to jump in there, and if so, we're coming up on our 90-minute window that went by so quickly, and I thank each and every one of you for taking your time out of your day to join us. And I'm hoping that the information we provided for you today was useful and will help you in your claim submissions in the future. And I look forward to having each of you back with us next month for our damages and unpaid rent. All right. Joanne, you've got a question for me that says that if there were no special claims submitted on a vacant unit, would that project lose the certification? I'm not sure I'm understanding your question. If you could maybe give me a little bit more information, or you could email it to me specifically. I can go back to my email address here for you and show it for you at the very beginning. Let me get up here. Let's see. There we go. There's my email address, appleby@inquadel.com. If you would want to just email me your question, maybe with a little more clarification, I could get an answer for you. And a question, Joanne, asking what would happen if the unit was vacant for several months with no special claims. Again, if you would like to email me with a little more information to help clarify that, you know, obviously we do have situations where units can sit vacant for quite some time. But I'm not understanding, if there are no special claims, what your question is there. I mean, you know, the unit has to be ready for occupancy. You have to have fulfilled all of the eligibility and submission requirements in order for there to be a special claim. If that doesn't exist, then there is no claim, potential reimbursement. So I'm not quite sure if there's something else to your question that I'm not catching. Okay, well, I think that being said, I think we'll close this up for the day. As I've said, you're all welcome. If you have specific questions that you think of, you know, feel free, regarding the special claims, feel free to email me, and I will do the best to answer your questions, or at least put you in the right direction where you can get them answered. And again, I thank you much for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you again next time. Have a good afternoon.